I want to give a big note of gratitude to Jared Fitzgerald for organizing our music this morning so that Mark Zimmerman and Yvonne could have this Sunday off. Jared, thank you very, very much. And for gathering Steve Bogart and I think some of your friends, I suspect. I know a lot of us are fans of Hamilton. The music is extraordinary. And the plot, that storyline, two esteemed, educated gentlemen, known for their civility, their rhetoric, their power of persuasion. And then they engage in this violent act, resulting in the death of Hamilton. Spoiler alert for those of you who didn't know that. Another duel took place between esteemed colleagues in 1838. 1838, a Democrat, US Democrat from Maine and a Whig from Kentucky. They engaged in a duel as well, and if you're keeping count, the Democrats lost a representative in that one. Consider other events in the esteemed halls of reason, otherwise known as US Congress, and the famous 1856 cane beating of Representative Charles Sumner by Representative Preston Brooks, made famous by a political cartoon. What didn't make the news at that time was in the 3 decades leading up to the Civil War, there were over 70 incidents of violence on the floor of the US Congress, including all-out sweaty brawls cheered on by those not otherwise engaged with their fists. The congressmen regularly carried pistols and Bowie knives. Some constituents even mailed their congressmen guns to ensure their safety. Now, the states, well, they also experienced violence in their own quote-unquote halls of reason in the state houses. Our elected representatives regularly lost their moral high ground in demands for reason and civility and democracy as they engaged in their own violence against each other. Hang on to these images, if you will. In these spaces where elevated rhetoric and the art of persuasion is held as a high ideal of democracy, it's an important image as we enter into the new year. And as we begin this year, the fissures in our country haunt us, fueled by anger and fear, suspicion, isolation, and loneliness. The result of these fissures is evident in a 2018 study that said that 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats stated that the United States would be better off if large numbers of the opposing party just died. This should be a cold blast to our warm liberal hearts, a wake-up call that there is too much pain in our country. And unless we act, our country will continue to split. On January 20th, we're going to have a new president sworn in, but the fissures, the pain, the hatred remain. And in fact, we're likely to see eruptions over the next month as soon as this coming Wednesday. Because for 4 years, Trump has encouraged and governed with a culture of force, affirming and spawning yet more forms of force and outright violence, demonstrated by increase in anti-government patriot groups and right-wing terrorist groups. Adding to our national discontent, rightfully so, is the recent heightened awareness of systemic racial oppression, spreading beyond the Black and liberal communities into mainstream American streets and manicured suburban lawns. As Black Lives Matter signs pop up, workshops, book sales increase, along with massive street protests. As we look at justice, our theme of the month for January, it's an invitation to move upward and gain a bird's eye view of these fissures that are spawning social unrest, to look for patterns and possible points of healing. How do we engage in the pursuit of justice matters. How we engage in it matters a great deal. A New Yorker issue of the week of November 16th, offers an in-depth examination of one important perspective that I liked. It's on how we pursue justice. They note a tension between force and persuasion. Force and persuasion. Sociologists and political scientists note it's a balancing act between force and persuasion throughout US history, presumably human history as well. We find it in overt and subtle forms: warfare versus diplomacy, violence versus reason, hawks versus doves, action versus negotiation, courts versus mediation. Right now, it's not clear which culture is winning, force or persuasion. Now, America's history, at least in the cleaned up version, says the United States was built upon reason and the art of persuasion. It's found in grand rhetoric and philosophic optimism, a common purpose embedded into Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, and theoretically in our halls of Congress, our elected officials. Yet in reality, the United States is not built upon persuasion and reason. It's also built upon violent act of overthrowing the British colonial overlords, followed by extended violence of annihilation of indigenous people, establishment of the institution of slavery, civil war, battles for civil rights, and a long history of oppression. And add that with the reflection on the violence on the floor of US Congress, you can kind of see that civil war was inevitable in the 1800s. Really, today's apparent rise in violence is part of a long thread established in the founding of this country. And yet this fissure, this tension of force versus persuasion is not as clean cut as that November 16th New Yorker article presents. Just a week later, the New Yorker had an article offering the history of nonviolent resistance, which is also a form of force where words have failed. Nonviolent protests, including boycott, demonstrations, they are all forms of force used by liberals throughout history. Recognize the use of force includes US labor movement, which is filled with violence, and nonviolent peace protests, civil rights, women's rights. More recently, the more violent anti-fascists or Antifa, with which liberals, all of which liberals, including Unitarian Universalists, have engaged. I remember feeling this tension myself between force and persuasion several years ago. I was working for Greenpeace, an activist organization dedicated to environmental preservation, engaging in force via nonviolent protests. At the same time I worked for Greenpeace, though, I volunteered for the Nature Conservancy, a more reasoned and persuasive approach to environmental issues by preserving land through legal protections. I felt then, and I still feel now, that both nonviolent force and reason are needed, whether it's for the environment, civil rights, racial justice, or the defense of democracy. History has shown that nonviolent resistance in all forms is often successful in its goals, particularly when broad-based across generations and includes a vast collection of alliances and partnerships of identity groups. This is going to inevitably include some very strange alliances and coalitions. For example, Clive Bundy and his not-so-merry band of armed militia. Now remember the 2014 standoff in Nevada against the Bureau of Land Management, and then that was repeated in 2016 in Oregon on a national wildlife refuge. Bundy publicly supports Black Lives Matter because he believes that the government should stay out of everyone's lives, no matter their race or their ethnicity. Another surprise affiliation is Unitarian Universalists became unintentionally engaged with and gratefully acknowledged Antifa in Charlottesville of 2017 Unite the Right rally. It was Antifa who protected the front line of clergy some of whom were my colleagues, including the Unitarian Universalist Association president, Susan Frederick Gray. It was Antifa who was willing to put their bodies on the line while not supporting their violent philosophy. Unitarian Universalist leadership was grateful for the protection for what surely would have been their heads getting bashed in without any protection. They're like pieces on a chessboard. There's a lot of movement of identity groups seeking solidarity, seeking coalitions and common goals. They engage in attention, and we figure out whether force or persuasion is needed. But what tips the scale toward violence? We have to look at that. And for good or for evil in today's world, the tipping scale toward force of any kind is news and social media. The entertainment value of action and force means top of the headlines, skewing what is really going on the streets. Whoever controls the attention of the masses gets results. And alas, that's not usually those who are engaging in calm voice of persuasion and reason. It doesn't sell. Also tipping the scale toward force, according to Susan Jacoby, who wrote The Age of American Unreason, is a strong culture of anti-reason and anti-intellectualism. You can see this demonstrated in Trump's fourth grade use of language and the imagery of force and a zero-sum game perspective, survivalism, us versus them. It's very, very simple and very, very dangerous. How we use the media, combined with our growing anti-intellectualism, means the country is ripe for creating even deeper fissures. It means it's ripe for normalizing violence, for loosening our social boundaries of what is acceptable behavior in a reasoned and civilized culture. And if you look even deeper, you dig in and see those who regularly advocate for force experience fear, existential threat, profound mistrust, along with belief in chaos and that massive change is necessary. That's according to the New Yorker November 16th article, but that article fails to note that both conservatives and liberals experience various levels of all of the above. So ask yourself, have you recently felt fear of our government, of neighbors? Have you had feelings of existential threat and a profound mistrust, again, of our government? Do you believe that some chaos and massive change is necessary in our country, particularly to break down the structures of white supremacy or stop the cycle of environmental destruction? My point is that both conservatives and liberals are experiencing fear, existential threat, and mistrust, along with pain and loneliness and isolation. Both believe that massive change is imminent and even necessary, and both feel force is inevitable. However, it's a matter of degree, how much we feel the fear and the threat, and then how do we respond to those emotions? While I believe massive change is necessary, we are going to have to work hard to avoid violence based on emotions that are unattended to. We have to work hard to further disintegrate our social bonds. That's what's holding our republic together. And if we fear one another, if we're isolated, our bonds break down. We have to have a deep commitment to nonviolence and to education if we're truly going to achieve liberation for all. There is only one path: nonviolence, education, strengthening our social bonds. Let's take one example of one place where this is particularly acute tension. That's defund the police. It's an old idea that came alive again last summer during the protest. And first, let's understand that defund the police is a headline meant to grab your attention, and it has. It's grabbed all of our attentions. For advocates, defunding the police means a massive shift of funding from policing and prisons to social services, housing, poverty, mental health. Advocates believe that crime prevention and deterrence is not achieved through punishment. Policing has become disconnected from protection of the public, and it's too entrenched in white supremacy power. It's better if we make sure people have jobs, are housed, out of the cycle of poverty, and their mental health is cared for. For some, defund the police means complete dismantling of police departments and prisons because they're too corrupted. The roots go back to 400 years of racist and oppressive violence. For others, it's a more moderate reform police departments, possibly, though, where necessary, dismantling some that are too entrenched in militarized abuse and mismanagement. Recently, we've seen a lot of headlines and stories about the Vallejo, California Police Department as one example of abuse and mismanagement. And for those supporting the police, it's about law and order. Against a perceived threat of anarchy, it's about nationalism tied to a carefully created image of public servants. Ironically, though, extreme militants, they're starting to be less supportive of the police because the police are preventing them from engaging in violence. In this complex example, we find the tensions are not as clear-cut between force and persuasion. It is quite murky. And in our bird's eye view, we have to ask questions. We have to listen. What is really at stake here is liberation for all. How we get there matters. So what role do Unitarian Universalists play in this tension between force and persuasion, between violence and reason? How does that inform our actions today? Last summer, the Unitarian Universalist Association voted at our General Assembly to defund the police through both nonviolent force and persuasion. Later, I'll post in the chat the link to that statement. The UA did this because our principles ask us to affirm the inherent worth and dignity in all people. Our principles call us to seek and create justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Our Universalist theology calls us to create heaven on earth, to dismantle all forms of institutional hell for those who are most powerless. And from this principled and theological foundation, historically, we Unitarian Universalists have both engaged in force, nonviolent, and persuasion. Today, we have a call to more actively engage locally and nationally for protection, for advocacy, for healing, for courage, for using our power to dismantle white supremacy, for saving our planet and each other. We are hearing a call for a moral awakening or a moral revival, as Reverend Dr. William Barber's Poor People's Campaign and proclaims wildly and widely. We have to hang on to this moral high ground because we're losing the high ground. The high ground is being eroded through loss of social cohesion and too many fissures in our culture. This is a time for building bridges across fissures, what may seem like odd partnerships and coalitions. It's a time to recognize differences without creating rigid boundaries. It's called to celebrate diversity, not expecting a false unity, particularly when that false unity is like to be based on a white patriarchal culture. It's a call for social engagement, crossing of borders, churches, neighborhoods, clubs, strengthening of our social network across diverse identities. This is not a world where all of us are going to agree with one another. Instead, it's one where healthy, civil, reasoned, and passionate discourse can take place. It's a call to recognize our fears, our loneliness, our isolation, but not letting these powerful emotions erode our capacity to love, our capacity to engage in compassion for ourselves and others, to seek nonviolent action for justice and liberation for all. So, what am I asking of you today? You actually already heard it in those beautiful words read by Sally Henryhan. I'm asking you, lament for the pain and the suffering. Create a place of bonding and a connection across fissures. Do not let despair hold you in an isolated corner. Reach out across odd partnerships to those you do not know or even understand. Ask yourself each and every day, how can you go about and create heaven here on earth? How can I am asking myself, how am I going to use my capacity to love so that liberation and freedom for all may thrive? For all may thrive. May it be so, and amen.